Okay, so let's assume that we have some spending. We're going to start with some spending. We're not going to explain where this comes from, but assume it's one of our spending components. So the spending components that make up GDP or aggregate demand, consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. And so it could be the result of fiscal policy, it could be the result of just people deciding to consume or invest more, it doesn't really matter. Let's just say we start with this $1,000 of spending. So we're going to call it autonomous spending because we're not trying to explain where this comes from. We're just going to look at the effects of this given certain assumptions. So one of the assumptions that we're going to have is that MPC is 0.8 and MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. So that just means the fraction of any dollar in disposable income that you get, and disposable income just means income available for spending. So after taxes, for example, so I get $1 of income and I'm going to spend 80 cents of it. So MPC becomes 0.8. We can change this number. Usually we're going to set this number and just assume that stays constant. So MPC is 0.8. So if we have this $1,000 of spending that for our purposes here just comes out of nowhere, someone decided to spend $1,000, then that becomes someone's income. And so when someone gets $1,000 in income, if MPC is 0.8, they're going to spend 800 bucks of it. And so remember, one of the key things here is that spending becomes income. So if someone spends $800, at some point that's becoming someone's income. I go buy some good with it. Someone's earning some income, gets paid out to wages, owners, doesn't matter, but someone is earning $800 in income and MPC is still 0.8. So we get this next round effect of this spending is 80% of that. And then that becomes income, and then we get 80% of that, and we can just keep going. Theoretically, if we can use all the decimal points we wanted, we can get an infinite series here. But obviously in practice, if this is going to happen, then there's going to be some finite number of steps. But for the formula that we're going to get, we can assume that this just keeps going. So we want to rewrite this series. We started with $1,000, and the next round effect is going to be 0.8 of that, $1,000 times 0.8, and the next round effect is going to be 0.8 of this value. So we can just multiply it again by 0.8. So we get 0.8 squared, 0.8 cubed, and so we want to get the sum of this series. So if we rewrite this, just factor out the $1,000, we can rewrite this series as this, right? We get the first term is 1,000, the second term is 1,000 times 0.8, and then 1,000 times 0.8 squared. So that's just this series rewrite like this, and then you can see, so this particular form of a series, if you've seen this before, this is a geometric series. If you haven't, then you'll just have to take my word for it here that a series in this form, as long as x is between 0 and 1, which it's going to be in these examples, then that sums to 1 over 1 minus x. So we're going to use that result to sum this series. And so 1 over 1 minus x being 0.8 and 0.8 being MPC, so we get 1 over 1 minus 0.2, which is 5. And so you take that $1,000, you multiply it by 5, and that gives you the sum of this series, right? So if we were able to do this sum, it would add up to $5,000. Obviously that's the absolute maximum that we would get from the sum, because we're assuming we get an infinite number of terms here and it's going to get very small, but we're summing up these infinite terms to get $5,000 in this case. And so this value here, that's going to be our multiplier. Right, so in this case it's a spending multiplier because we assumed that one of our spending categories is what started this whole process. So it's got to be one of those categories: consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports, one of those categories that makes up total spending that goes into GDP or into aggregate demand. So 1 over 1 minus MPC is what you're going to multiply that initial amount to get the sum of this series. Okay, so now let's suppose instead of increasing spending, so we might think of this as fiscal policy, for example, although it doesn't have to be, but so if we spend directly, we're going to get this spending multiplier. If instead we do a stimulus by cutting taxes, then we get a different result here, because in these examples, under the assumptions that we're looking at, spending is really the only thing that matters when we're talking about multipliers here. So notice that if I cut your taxes by $1,000, I am raising your income by $1,000, and in terms of spending, what happens? Well, I spend MPC of that. So we're still assuming MPC of 0.8. So I don't spend 1,000, I spend 800. So that's why the first term in the series is now 800, and then we get the same spending effects that we got before. So someone spends 800, someone else gets income of 800, the next round effect is 0.8 of that, and so you can see it's the same series except I lost that first term. So a tax cut has this indirect effect on spending, whereas if we started with one of those spending components, it's more direct, and you get that initial full effect of the spending here because it's changing your income, and you might be saving. In these cases, savings isn't really doing anything, and so we have to, we're making an assumption here that the savings aren't at least immediately ending up as spending. And so we're just looking at the effect on spending. Income goes up by 1,000. The first spending effect is 80% of that. So that's why it's the same series except for that first term, which is why this is going to add up to 4,000 instead of 5,000. And so if we look at, so here it's spending multiplier over here. So you can think of it as 0.8 times this whole series, because that would give you, the same sum minus that first term. So if you could think of it as MPC times the spending multiplier, because it's just 0.8, that first round effect is 0.8 of that, and so that gives you MPC over 1 minus MPC. So that term here, that is the tax multiplier. You can see it's always going to be less since MPC is between 0 and 1, and you can see that in this case the multiplier is 4 instead of 5, and so it's always going to be 1 less than the spending multiplier because you lost that first term, which was a multiple of 1 of whatever you spent initially. So we lost that multiple of 1 there, so it's going to be 1 less than the spending multiplier. I should also mention it's really the tax and transfer multiplier, because if you cut taxes by 1,000 or you just did a transfer of 1,000, so the government just cuts you a check and gives you $1,000 while your income went up by 1,000, has the same effect. So taxes or transfers have the effect of using this multiplier here, which is just going to call it the tax multiplier, versus a direct spending effect gets you that full multiplier of 5 in this case, assuming that MPC is 0.8.